Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome all our viewers, everybody who joined us on our YouTube channel. Thanks very much for joining. Thank you, Forrest, for accepting our invitation. This reading is organized by the Eco-Poetological Laboratory at Warsaw University, which is led by Professor Gerardo Beltran, who's here with us, and myself as part of our non-anthropocentric cultural subjectivity research center. And I will introduce Forrest, who is known to many readers in Poland already, and then we'll have a reading. So Forrest Gander is a poet, essayist, and translator who was born in California's Mojave Desert, grew up in Virginia, studied geology and literature, lived briefly in Mexico, where his poetry, informed by his knowledge of geology, turned its attention to the landscape as a source of action. After spending several years in Providence, Rhode Island, where he taught at Brown University, Gander moved back to California, where he now resides, and he is joining us from California today. Gander's newly released book, Twice Alive, it was published last year, addresses the exigencies of our historical moment and the intimacies, personal and environmental, that bind us to others and to the world. It is this book that we're going to focus on during this reading. I have translated a few poems from it, so we'll read the English and also a few translations. And before Twice Alive, Gander also published Be With. That was 2018. This book is available in Polish. It won the Pulitzer Prize. Core Samples from the World, that's 2011. It's a volume which is studied with the work of three great photographers. Eye Against Eye, with photographs by Sally Mann, Torn Awake, Science, and Steeple Flower. Forrest Gander is also an esteemed translator from the Spanish and a novelist and an editor of poetry anthologies. He has translated mostly Mexican women poets, including Coral Bracho, but also, for instance, the Bolivian author Jaime Sáenz, is that the right pronunciation? Yes, and Pablo Neruda. Okay, so Forrest, welcome. And you were supposed to be here in person. We were hoping that you would actually come to Poland and that we would have a series of readings. But when we were organizing this event, when we were putting it together, that was the moment when the war in Ukraine broke out, and it was hard to predict what was going to happen. And so once again, we're meeting through Zoom in this format. Still, it's great to have you here.
I'm so glad to see you and to be with you, even by this means. And it's not also, I think, that art and poetry don't have a place during war. I think of Susan Sontag, for instance, staging a production of Beckett's Waiting for Godot in the besieged city of Sarajevo. And then of a friend of mine, Ryuichi Wago, a Japanese poet who stayed with his elderly parents in Fukushima after the nuclear meltdown, writing Twitter poems about daily life there after everyone else was evacuated. And I think people in poverty and war and emotional turmoil often find hope in art and poetry. But with so many refugees streaming into Poland, our ethical coordinates were rearranged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. A lot of great poetry is coming these days also from Ukraine, and it's also very, very present here in Poland. So I agree, it's important. So let's read some poems.
All right. Shall I start?
Yes, you start.
So this poem, which is from Twice Alive, is called Immigrant Sea. I've been thinking, as lots of people have around the world, about immigration. It's the largest, fastest immigration in human history, migration across borders. and I'm married now to an immigrant to the United States from southern India. And I've also been thinking about how the ocean is a constant immigrant at every continent, and a welcomed one. Immigrant sea, aroused by her inaccessibility, he aches for more of her life to live inside him, watching the breakers, standing so close he can feel heat coming off her wet scalp. What is his relation to this person before him, so familiar and foreign? The way he searches out her face, he searches out himself. Gusts thrash crests of swell. Spring grasses twirl circles in the sand where they stand without speaking. She wants him to know it's all charged, even grass, positive, pollen, negative. So when grass waves, it sweeps the air for pollen. He feels electricity all around, as though the wild drama of the coming storm were already aware of them, foreigners on this shore. Little sapphire blue flowers speckle the dunes. He wonders if he has let himself flatten out into a depthless sheet, like escalator stairs, whether in the end he'll disappear underground without the smallest lurch of resistance. But when her lavish face turns toward him, beaming, the corners of her eyes wind wet, he yields to that excess. He reappears to himself. There happens to be a really terrific Polish translation of this poem.
I've got it here. I'm not sure how terrific it is, but I've got it here in front of my eyes, so I'll read it. No, it's a really gorgeous poem. Thank you. Yeah, okay, so I'll read my translation. Imigranckie morze. Pobudza go jej niedostępność. Pragnąłby jej życia. Niechby bardziej w nim żyło. Patrzą na falujące morze, stojąc tak blisko siebie, że wyczuwa bijące od jej mokrych włosów ciepło. Co łączy go z tą tu osobą, tak znajomą i obcą? Badając jej twarz, bada sam siebie. Podmuchy wiatru ubijają grzywy fal, źdźbła wiosennych traw rysują okręgi na piasku, gdzie oni są bez słów, a chciałabym mu powiedzieć, że wszystko ma ładunek, nawet trawa dodatni, pyłki zaś ujemne. Więc kiedy trawa faluje, to jakby łowiła w powietrzu. On wyczuwa elektryczność, jakby dziki dramat nadchodzącej burzy, coś już o nich wiedział, obcych na tym brzegu. Drobne szafirowe kwiaty ozdabiają wydmy. Zastanawia się, czy dał się sobie spłaszczyć, wygładzić jak ruchome schody i czy w końcu zniknie pod powierzchnią bez jednego szarpnięcia, bez oporu. Ale odwraca się ku niemu jej promienna szczodra twarz z wilgocią w kącikach oczu od wiatru. Pokonany tym przepychem, znowu się sobie pojawia. I really love reading this poem. It's, I think, the second time that I've read it. In reading with you, yes, I really love it. This whole collection is really quite amazing. I wanted to ask you about the title, because the title is Twice Alive, but it has a subtitle, An Ecology of Intimacies. And I wanted to ask you about this intimacy. What is this intimacy, and what does it have to do with your understanding of ecology in these poems?
Yeah. So, as you know, the book makes a lot of reference to lichen. What's the Polish word for lichen?
Porosty.
Poroste. Poroste. About which it turns out scientists know very little. We do know that what we call lichen is a collaborative organism, in large part a collaboration between a fungus and an algae or a cyanobacteria. but the fungus and algae have their own lives. And when they merge, they take on a second life. They're twice alive. And that second life gives them completely new characteristics. They live as something else. And according to mycologists like Anne Pringle, with whom I had the lucky opportunity to work, it may be that lichen, given sufficient nutrients, don't age. It may be that some organisms have theoretical immortality. And the thought of two things that come together, forming a mutual new thing that may not die, makes me think of the nature of human intimacy. As I say in my little preface, isn't it often in our most intimate relations that we come to realize that our identity and all identity is combinatory?
Do you want to say a bit more about your collaboration with Anne Pringle? How did you work together?
So I grew up being raised by a single mother who was a working, she was a teacher. I ended up having lots of free time after school because she would still be working. And I spent most of it in the woods and became pretty good at identifying reptiles and amphibians and trees. But I didn't much notice fungus. And I was invited to work together, to have a collaboration with a literary critic, this biologist, a mycologist, Anne Pringle, a Native American artist, and a photographer at a very special place in the United States, which is one of the best preserved old forests in the country. And there, with Anne Pringle, we went into the woods and she began to point out mushrooms and lichen, which were around us constantly, which are around all of us constantly. Lichen is on some 92% of the Earth's surface. And I became really fascinated by both lichen and fungus and how connected they are to other life systems. So we did a project and it turned into an exhibition that has shown, and it'll turn into a very wonderful book with that will open with bronze sculptures of different mushrooms in it by Emily Arthur, the Native American artist, and a poem by me and a critical essay by the literary critic.
That sounds great. I know lichens, I think, or at least some lichens are also indicative of the health of an ecosystem. So they also tell you about how, like, what is the condition of a particular environment. And I know this feeling of discovering lichens, and it's like discovering a whole new world that has always been very close, right? But we didn't pay attention to it. There is a Polish poet, Michał Książek, who compares lichens to coral reef. You know, the reaches of the coral reef that is, you know, so close to us. Yes, and yeah.
And that is equally sensitive to environmental conditions. The coral reef, which is dying so much all over the world because of the acidification of the oceans, and lichen, which is killed very quickly by pollution. And so both are indicators of the health of the system that we live in, the sort of canary in the coal mine. Do they have that metaphor in Polish? Yeah.
Okay, please, will you read another poem for us?
Okay. So maybe before I read this poem, I should tell you something about the trajectory of these Sangam poems. Is it the right time?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes, yes.
So because we all find ourselves right now in this exact moment deeply embedded in an environmental disaster, which is unprecedented in human history and caused in large part by human recklessness, it comes about through our sense of human exceptionalism, I think, our sense that we're superior to other life forms and independent of them. Because scientists have been warning us for 30 years about global warming and fossil fuels and plastics. But because changes on the earth are slow to appear in human time, we've failed to take those warnings seriously. And many governments and citizens still insist on very short-term economic benefits of extractive practices that devastate our planet, and it's diminishing billions of species. So cultural habits, of course, are hard to change, but we desperately need a chorus now from writers and artists and journalists, from politicians, from everyone, really, to begin to understand ourselves in relation to others, human and otherwise, because we aren't so special and we have no right to be given, as the Bible asserts, dominion over all the creatures of the earth, which are simply here to serve us until we drive them to extinction. And there have been many cultures that have celebrated our mutuality with the earth and its creatures. And I think we have something to learn from them about how the human is entangled in a web of critical relations, something that you write a lot about, Yulia. In my book, I celebrate one such cultural tradition, which is called Sangam. And 2,000 years ago, there was this blossoming of literature in southern India that came to be called Sangam, which means convergence. And one of two styles of that literature is called Akam. It's a poetry in which personal emotions are linked to landscape in such a way that human feeling is expressed as inseparable from the place where that feeling occurs. It was considered not only unethical, but impossible to write about human feeling as though it weren't affected by the world around and in relation to the human. Scholars of Sangam argue that the boundaries between inner and outer landscapes were considered porous, and that the ultimate goal of Sangam poetry was the dissolution of any split between self and landscape. So this poem is one of the many poems in my book influenced by Sangam poetry. It's called Forrest. Erogenous zones in oaks slung with stoles of lace lichen, but sun's rays spilling through leaves in packets. A force, call it nighttime, thrusts mushrooms up from their lair of spawn, mycelial loam, the whiff of port. They pop into untrammeled air with a sort of gasp that follows a fine chess move. Like memories, are they? Or punctuation? Was it something the earth said to provoke our response, tasking us to recall an evolutionary course, our long ago initiation into the one among others? And within my newborn noticing, have you popped up beside me, love? Or were you here from the start, a swarm of meaning and decay still gripping the underworld? Both of us, half buried, holding fast, if briefly, to a swelling vastness, while our coupling begins to register in the already awake compendium that offers to take us in. You take me in, and abundance floods us, floats us out. We fill each with the other all morning, breaks as birdsong over us, who rise to the surface so our faces might be sprung.
Thank you so much. When you speak about entanglements, what comes to my mind is also that the poems, your poems usually, but maybe especially in this book, that the way in which they are written, I mean, the form, the poetics reflects these entanglements on the level of sound, on the level of these thick descriptions, that one almost feels sensually through listening, through experiencing the language of these poems, the entanglements that you're talking about, yes, that are also the subject matter of this book.
So, and I feel very much a part of a group of writers who have sort of collectively been called eco-poets, who are using this kind of, who are interested in trying to find a way to write where human subjectivity doesn't take a kind of precedent over other forms of life, isn't just domineering. And Yulia, you're one representative of that kind of writing, and Corral Bracho in Mexico, and Alfonso De Quino in Mexico, and Inger Christensen. I think a lot of us are interested in trying to find a writing that suggests a new way of thinking about the human in relationship to the non-human. And that's critical for us if we're going to actually address the environmental crisis that we're in.
Mm-hmm. And not just talk about it, right? But also, like you said, to try to find a way to talk about this, to try to find a new poetics.
To enact it with syntax, with rhythm, with sound, with motif, so that we understand ourselves as part of a mutuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to me that this is what poetry can contribute. Because when you said earlier about how cultural habits are hard to change and how they're slow to change, and people always complaining that poetry makes nothing happen, right? I think that the contribution of poetry perhaps is not so much in like what it says, but how it says, right? So this new language, this enactment of entanglements, of this new understanding of human subjectivity that you have been talking about, that this is something, this seems to me the contribution of poetry. So it's like what it is capable of doing on the level of its craft, yes, what it is capable of doing with language. And because obviously there are other art forms that have other means, and there are other discourses that have other means, that produce other ways of knowing. Science is fundamental, journalism is fundamental, but I believe that what poetry has to contribute is precisely this, right? It's precisely this, and that's one of the reasons why I love this book so much, Twice Alive, because I think it's such a great experiment, yes, in this new form, in this new a way of writing that opens something up in ourselves. And I've always had this experience with your poetry that it takes time.
And vice versa. This book is influenced by your own book. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I was going to say that it takes time to read these poems carefully, but that's the point, right? Because this experience, which cannot be fast, which has to be slow, which requires attention. This experience, I find it also deeply transformative.
We don't want the attention that the poems require to be an obligation or like a duty of the reader. What one hopes is that readers are the same with looking at art, that that the sense of involvement in making the meaning, instead of having the meaning simply presented to you, gift wrapped, as some easier forms of poetry do, that just sort of valorizes what people already feel. You want to bring people into a mystery where they're involved in the poem, in the artwork itself, so that at that level of attentiveness, I think it offers the possibility of expanding our ways of seeing. And that's what art has always done for me.
Is Kenneth Rexroth an important poet for you? Because he appears also in Twice Alive.
Yeah, you mentioned that Rexroth isn't widely known in Poland, but he was a major figure in the United States. He's a completely self-taught intellectual, translator, a political radical, and a writer in multiple forms. And he was part of, sort of like Robert Creeley, was part of a number of different really signal groups. In the 1930s, he was connected with a group of writers called the Objectivists, which included George Oppen and Louis Zukowski. And he was in touch with Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams. Then in the next decade, he was at the center of a group that came to be known as the San Francisco Renaissance, with poets like Jack Spicer and Robert Duncan and Madeline Gleason, who was was a collaborator with Rexroth. And then in the 60s, he introduces Gary Snyder to Allen Ginsberg. They didn't know each other, and he introduces both of them to the world at the famous 6-gallery reading where Ginsberg reads Howl. So he's also connected with the beat poets. He shows up as a character in Jack Kerouac's Dharma Bums. He was one of the first good translators of Japanese poetry into English, and his poems are very influenced by jazz. And what we maybe mostly remember him by now are his erotic poems, which are really beautiful.
Okay, will you read the poem about?
Okay. So when I moved out to California, one of my hejiras was to visit the site where Rexroth had built a little cabin. He'd rebuilt a cabin. Actually, it had been built. It was a fisher person's cabin in the middle of the woods, and he rebuilt it and used it as his study and stayed there for several summers and did his writing. And so I went to find the ruins of his cabin. And the title of the poem is Rexroth's Cabin. On the way to the site of his cabin, his temple, refurbished from the plundered temple of another religion, a religion of fishermen, on the Toquelalume, aka Lagunitas Creek in Devil's Gulch, the path into the forest flagged on either side with orange, sticky monkey flowers, innumerable stubby, macho fence lizards rush in bursts ahead of you like heralds as you come up the trail. But half a mile in, a single western skink, its neon blue tail hauled upright behind it, races diagonally cross trail and disappears beneath thimbleberry brambles mantled with shredded spiderweb. In the epic literature of India, which all those years ago he was reading, lying on this gray whack slab above the ebulliently plashing creek, his head in shade, his lanky body warm, legs crossed in the sun's maple light breaking through tree limbs, pajamaed in moss, and stretching awkwardly out over the gulch from a steep hillside held in place only by radial green explosions of bracken, maidenhead fern, and a pair of red-spiked black caterpillars, which crawl onto his leather boots, set side by side in the rampant pipe vine the caterpillars have been devouring. In all that epic literature of India, no more than 3 colors are mentioned. See, he is here and not here, not unlike you yourself, or the water striders in the creek, rowing in punctuated contractions against the drift. What you see in the clear absolute of the water as you stand on some paleo stump at the bank under an electric insect wine distributed perfectly through the canopy. What you see below in the pellucid water is a cluster of 6 Gothic black shadow dots cast onto the stream bed below the thin sand-colored bodies of the actual water striders who are bowed all but invisibly above the tensile surface of the stream. Not here and here. And though you have hiked the dirt path through the forest, as he did before you were born, to the familiar place, the confluence of 2 modest falls, to the ground truth, the little clearing where he snored and fried 2 eggs for breakfast and sat cross-legged on a slab of rock, scribbling into the future that holds you in it. You are only still arriving. No trace of the cabin left, and yet his presence is not decomposable. Your mind merges with what is not your mind. Your happiness is radiant, and you squat listening in the tangible density of what is and isn't there, as you become your shadow, fluidly contiguous with the shadows of trees.
Thank you.
So I see the imagery in that poem, an important part of it depends upon having an idea of what water striders are. Are there water striders in Poland?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, good.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
And what is the word for those, Julia?
Nartniki.
Nartniki.
Nartniki. Yes.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah, we have them. So this image is clear, but I have to say that the translation which I am going to read is a working translation. I just made some corrections to it as you were reading now. So so it really is a work in progress. So okay, I'll read it. Chata Rexrotha. Po drodze do miejsca, gdzie stała jego chata, jego świątynia, zbudowana na ruinach splądrowanej świątyni innej religii rybaków, stokę Lalume, zwanego również potokiem Lagunitas w diabelskim wąwozie. Kiedy ścieżka obrębiona z obu stron na pomarańczowo lepkimi kroplikami nurkuje w las, przysadziste i maczo kolcogwane biegną przodem jak posłańce. Kiedy pniesz się po szlaku, a pół mili dalej pojedyncza scynka z zadartym jaskrawo-niebieskim ogonem przecina ci drogę i znika w krzakach jeżyn obleczonych poszarpaną pajęczyną. W indyjskich eposach, które czytał wiele lat temu, leżąc na tej bryle szarogłazu, nad gwałtownie pluszczącym potokiem, z głową w cieniu, grzejąc szczupłe ciało z nogami skrzyżowanymi w klonowym słońcu, które przedzierało się przez kończyny drzew otulone mchem, niewygodnie sterczące nad wąwozem ze stromego zbocza, ledwo przytrzymywane w miejscu przez promieniste zielone eksplozje orlic, złotowłosów i parę czarnych gąsienic o czerwonych kolcach, które pełzały po jego skórzanych butach, ułożonych jeden obok drugiego w gęstym kokornaku, które te gąsienice pożerały. We wszystkich tych indyjskich eposach wymienia się tylko 3 kolory. Widzisz? Jest tu i go nie ma. Nie inaczej z tobą. Albo z nartnikami w potoku, śmigającymi w rytmicznych skurczach pod prąd. Stoisz na jakimś skamieniałym pniu, na brzegu absolutnie przezroczystej wody, pod elektrycznym zawodzeniem owadów niosącym się doskonale pośród liści i w dole, w krystalicznej wodzie, widzisz tylko 6 gotyckich plamek cienia, rzucanych na dno potoku przez chude ciała nartników w kolorze piasku, przez ich prawdziwe ciała, prawie niewidzialne na rozciągliwej powierzchni wody. Nie ma go i jest. Choć przywędrowałeś tu ścieżką przez las, tak jak on wędrował, zanim się urodziłeś, do znajomego miejsca, gdzie spotykają się 2 niewielkie wodospady, do podstawowej prawdy, do prześwitu, w którym chrapał, smażył 2 jajka na śniadanie i siadał na skale, żeby dopisać się do przyszłości, w której jesteś, to nadal przybywasz, stale przybywający. Nie ma już śladu po chacie, lecz jego obecność nie rozkłada się. Twój umysł łączy się z tym, czego nie ma. Twój umysł, twoje szczęście promienieją, więc przysiadasz, nasłuchując w gąszczu tego, co jest i czego nie ma. Stajesz się cieniem samego siebie, płynnie przylegającym do cieni drzew.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. It's been a great experience trying to translate it. This poem feels like, I mean, reading this poem, and translation is, of course, a way of reading, right? It is like actually going through this thick woods, like finding one's path through the thick forest with all the beings that we encounter on our way there. So so it's been lovely to try to translate it.
You used that word earlier, thick description, which is a term also used by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, which has been very important to me as a way of understanding our embeddedness in so many other lives and circumstances.
Yeah, I think it's very clear when we read these poems that that's how it works. Will you read one more because I thought we might close this part of the reading with one last poem from Twice Alive?
Okay. This is a poem, I think it's the first poem in the book, and it's written really for now. I think of it as a poem for all of those that we've lost during the pandemic, including my mother. And it's an aubade. Can you hear dawn edging close? Hear soft light with its vacuum fingertips gripping the bedroom wall. An understated what? Exhilaration? Can you hear the voices, if they can be called voices, of towies scratching in the garden, and then the creaky, low, husky voice flecked with sleep beside you in bed, telling a dream slowly as though in real time. And now, interrupting that dream, can you make out the voice, if it can be called a voice, of absence speaking intimately to you directly, using the names of those who were vulnerable, those who are gone? I know you must hear it feelingly, a low vibration in your bones, for don't you find yourself absorbed in a next moment beyond your given life.
Thank you very much. I wanted to move back now in time to your previous book, although I will ask you only to read one poem from this book, since we spent quite a bit of time talking about it when we met last year. So Be With is a book that, well, as is well known, grows out of grief, and it's usually discussed as a lamentation, as a book of mourning. But another aspect of it, which I find really fascinating, not just that book, but that book also, is how you incorporate a kind of geological temporality. And I've asked you this question before, but if you could talk again about the importance of geology and your knowledge of geology, your experience also, because you studied geology, for your poetry, and for creating this sort of ecology that incorporates also the inorganic as part of these, or the mineral beings as part of various more than human worldlings that we encounter in life and in your poems also. I don't know if this question makes any sense. I mean, sorry, this is sorry, it's so complicated, but like in short, I wanted to ask you about geology, and I am really fascinated with mineral beings, yes, and with how this relationship between life and rock, or what we consider as living and what we consider as dead sometimes, is much more complicated. And somehow in some ways, I think Be With is perhaps also a meditation on this proximity.
Yeah, proximity is a really lovely word for it. I think of the Greeks and how their religious ideas and mythological ideas involved a huge underworld of a space, and how that must have been affected by the geology of Greece, which is a karst topography with so many caves and limestone caverns underneath the ground, that gave rise to their imagination of an underworld. And I think of this someone who writes about the mineral fact and who's very important to me is the poet George Oppen, who says also the mystery being the self is no mystery. The mystery is that we have something to stand on. We want to be here. The act of being more than oneself. That what we stand on, both ethically and physically, geologically, are connected. And so in this poem, well, just in all of our lives, I think that when we come to think about it, we recognize that our perceptions and our deepest feelings are very connected to and influenced by what is around us. And in this poem, where I'm grieving for, as I still am always and will be until I die, the loss of my wife, the great poet C.D. Wright. I was spending a lot of time alone in the forest and metabolizing that grief. And this poem is a sort of record of that. The Madonna del Parto is that famous painting of the Virgin Mary wearing a robe, a beautiful blue robe that splits at her belly because she's so pregnant. and that split in the landscape of her body reminded me of what I saw in the landscape that I was standing in. Madonna del Parto. And then smelling it, feeling it before the sound even reaches him. He kneels at cliff's edge and for the first time turns his head toward the now visible falls that gush over a quarter mile of uplifted sheet granite across the valley. And he pauses, lowering his eyes for a moment, unable to withstand the tranquility, vast, unencumbered, terrifying, and primal. That naked river enthroned upon a massive altar, bowed cypresses congregating on both sides of sun-gleaming rock, a rip in the fabric of the ongoing forest from which rises, as he tries to stand, tottering, half paralyzed, a shifting rainbow volatilized by ceaseless explosion.
Okay.
So you're looking at a waterfall across the valley, and the waterfall reminding me of the Madonnas.
Mm-hmm.
But,
So I'll read the translation now. The translation appeared in a book, Bądź Blisko, which was published by Lokator from Kraków a couple of years ago. So we have this book in Polish now. Madonna del Parto.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to you.
Thank you. Tak więc zapach. Czuję ją, zanim dotrze do niego jej huk. Przyklęka na krawędzi skały. Wtedy dopiero zwraca twarz ku teraz już widocznej kaskadzie pędzącej przez ćwierć mili uniesionego w poprzek doliny batolitu. Zamiera, spuszcza wzrok, przez moment nie może wytrzymać spokoju, potężnego, bezwarunkowego i strasznego w swojej pierwotności. Ta naga rzeka wyniesiona na masywny ołtarz, otoczony przez wierne cyprysy o pochylonych głowach po obu stronach błyszczącej w słońcu skały, pruje materiał lasu, z którego, kiedy on, chwiejąc się na wpół sparaliżowany, próbuje wstać, wyrasta ruchoma tęcza, ulatująca w niekończącej się eksplozji. I wanted to ask you about collaboration, the importance of collaboration generally in your work, because I think that one of the basic characteristics of your work is crossing borders, like crossing borders between disciplines, poetry and science, between various media, artistic media, poetry and photography or sculpture or dance even, right? You're yourself a translator. What is important to you about working with other people, including other people's work sometimes in your books?
That old romantic model of the writer as the isolated poet writing at, in his garret, usually a male, alone, the genius that makes work from nothing, hasn't served us well, and I think is a false myth that books always come from other books, that our ideas, just like our language, come out of what's come before us, and that collaboration is a kind of social model that I admire, of letting go of some of the ego, some of the sense of needing to control everything, to participate with someone else in exploring what might not have occurred to you on your own. And so it's also a way of bringing forth from the artist new possibilities. So I've long collaborated with different artists across different genres. Most recently with the sculptor Ashwini Bhatt, who is now my partner. We just had a large exhibition at University of California, Davis, involving the circumambulation of Mount Tamalpais. Mount Tamalpais is one of the, it's considered the guardian mountain of the San Francisco Bay and was very important to the native Miwok population. And then Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg mapped out a circumambulation, which is a clockwise walk around a holy place. And you ascend the mountain, it's 15 miles upward, that they each wrote poems about, and that in the 60 years since they wrote those poems, people have followed that circumambulation to pay tribute and to honor both the mountain and our relationship to the mountain here in San Francisco. So Ashwini Bhatt built a number of sculptures. I made a poetry film, poetry video, and that was just on exhibition. I've also collaborated with my favorite living artist, Anne Hamilton, on Work Together, where she was doing a kind of visual, using photography with my words in it as a response to what has been called here the Boston massacre, when the bombs went off during the running of the Boston Marathon. And I've also I've collaborated with a lot of people, but another artist that I collaborated with is the Buto dancer, who goes by the name Eiko, E-I-K-O. And we've performed and done work in, and then I have a book also all over the world, actually, in Japan, in Chile, in New York.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that this has become, has it been a process for you when you speak about like letting go, right, and being able to like abandon the control of your own work? Has it come sort of naturally and automatically to you, or has it been a process? Has it become maybe easier with time, or how do you think about this? Because also being translated is also like letting go.
That's right where I was going. Yeah, Julia, right where I was going. I think that you also know that I think it comes out of my interest in translation, which happened first, that in translation, a good translator, I think, disappears to allow the work that the translator is reading to take place inside the mind and body of the translator. And that if you're too focused on controlling the translation comes out in your own voice. But if you give up control and allow yourself to be vulnerable enough so that the music of someone else's mind enters your mind, then that allows you to become a good translator. So I think that was a model that set me on the path towards other forms of collaboration and giving up control. Mm-hmm. How about you?
I love collaborating with other people as well. I really like this. I like to share, because I'm also absolutely convinced that the imagination is collective. I'm sure of it. I know none of my books was written by myself exclusively, even if I'm the only one who signs it. I know it's a collective endeavor. So yeah, I'm completely sure of it. Yes. And translation as a part of creative practice, as something which isn't extra and different from our own work that we're doing, but that is just one part of what we're doing as writers, or one that it's like, once again, there is I think a proximity between one's own writing and translation. So for me, I don't translate much. I have only translated a few books, but this experience has been important. And I also thought about like my or your work being translated into other languages, that this is also where you have to let go, yes, and allow for your work to be read the way that people want to read it, and to exist in other voices. And I also find this experience really wonderful, to be able to listen, for example, to the work that started as my work in a language that I don't understand. I think that's great.
And also your work has been translated into languages that you do understand and can follow. Yeah.
Yes. And that's also interesting, because I've been incredibly lucky with the wonderful and generous translators, and one of them is actually here, Gerardo. And to hear, it's true, and to encounter something that started as my own work in another language that I can understand, but it's still it's a new poem, it's a new work.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yes, that's really interesting, because you discover completely new things, and you read your own work as if, it's no longer just your own, yes, but it is collaborative. Maybe it just shows that every work is always collaborative. Yeah,
is always breaking free of the self.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that word you've used a couple times during our conversation, proximity, is one that's very important to the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who distinguishes between our desire for transcendence, which can be a singular thing, something that just happens to the self, and proximity, our desire to be next to be influenced by, to be receptive to what's not us, what's otherness.
Be with, to refer to the title of your collection. Okay, so let's move back in time a little bit more, and it would be lovely if you could choose a couple of poems for us from your older books.
Well, I wondered if, so because translation is so important to me, I consider it a part of my own work and very connected to my own work. I thought I might read a poem or two by two people that I've translated that share some of the concerns that we've been talking about today. Would that be okay?
Oh, that would be wonderful. Great.
So this is a book by a Mexican poet named Alfonso De Quino, who was very early on given a prestigious award by Octavio Paz when he was just in his 20s, but who left the circles of poetry in Mexico City for the desert, where he knows all of the medicinal plants and the stars and the rocks and the lizards. This is a poem that he's written in 2 columns. You probably can't see this. Well, you sort of can. 2 columns, and the poem in Spanish can be read both horizontally across that caesura, or the columns can be read also, it makes sense, if you read one column and then the other column. So let me read the Spanish vertically, just one column, and then I'll read the whole poem horizontally in English. It's called Fronda. No tiene ninguna forma la hoja en medio de las hojas. Las hojas que no son el aire, sino el aire que lo ocupa. Y una copa cabe en otra, dentro de una sola hoja. Movimiento de la fronda que desvela otra rosa. Y una en otra se transforma como un cielo entre dos hojas. Invisible rama loca se retuerce por sí sola. Si una hoja y otra hoja siempre son la misma hoja. And here it is horizontally. This is Alfonso De Quino. It's formless. From within the leaves I see the leaf in the middle, one brushing another of the leaves that keep it company. Leaves aren't the alder's a tree. All the tree, a leaf, but the air that holds all the alder in its sleeve, and more leaves. And trees drink each other in, and a frond emerges from one of them, tangled in the branches, a singular leaf among the leaves. Gesticulation of the frond, from within its patterns, I see disclosing in the shadowed bower another flower, the other flower. And each moves into the other, and the phylum transfloresces like a sky invisibly woven and between two leaves opening out. Wild, invisible branch, the stalk and the corolla twisting, spirals darkening into one form and digging in. If one leaf and another leaf from the unseen branch always are to the shade of this leaf, the same leaf falling broken. He's a terrific poet. And I thought I'd read the beginning of another poem. This is by the great Mexican poet Cural Bracho. And I've just translated, in fact, it's just come out, a new book of hers, which is coming out as a double book with this book in England and then as a separate book in the United States. This is a poem called Agua de Bordes Lublicos. And I would ask you to try to listen to the vowel soundings in her work. Agua de medusas, agua láctea, sinuosa, agua de bordes lúbricos, espesura vidriante, deliquescencia entre contornos delitosos, agua, agua suntuosa de involución, de languidez, en densidades plácidas, agua, agua sedosa y plumbia, en opacidad, en peso, mercurial, agua en vilo, agua lenta, el alga acuática de los bríos, en los ubres del gozo, el alga, el hálito de su cima. Water's lubricious edges, water of jellyfish, lacteal, sinuous water, water of lubricious borders, glassy thickness, deliquescence in delectable contours, water, sumptuous water of involution, of languor, in placid densities, water, water silken and plumbeous in opacity, in weight, mercurial water, in suspense, slow water, the algal bloom brilliant, in the paps of pleasure, the algae, the bracing vapor of its peak, across the arched silence, across isthmuses of basalt, the algae, its habitual rub, its slippage, light water, fish water, the aura, the agate, its luminous border breakings, fire trailing, the fleeing, and it goes on. But you feel in the poem that even more important than the semantic meaning of her poems is the rhythmic and sonic meaning that the poem makes. We feel that water lapping in this whew, this sort of O and U heavy vowel patterns that I just find really delicious.
It is, and I think it's a really great translation. Thank you so much for sharing these with us. And well, I have to know, because I have read both of these poets before, but I read them because of you. I mean, I'm very grateful also for your work as a translator, and for what you do to for how much you talk about other artists always, how much you talk about other poets, how you're very often making connections between people, and I've learned a lot through you also about other poets in this way. So thanks so much for
Thanks.
for this. So we will be wrapping up shortly, and I would like to remind the people who are viewing us on YouTube that you're very welcome to ask questions or make comments or just to say hello, just to show that you're there. And to close, we were going to play a video which it's a video to one of the poems from Twice Alive, right? So because
Yes.
the idea is that we will close with another poem from the book that we started from. Okay, so did you want to say something about this before we try to play the video?
Well, I think it's sort of, in some ways, a culmination of a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. Yeah, it should speak for itself.
Okay. All right. Also, people who are on Zoom are here with us are most welcome to join this conversation. So let's try. So we're now relying on Piotr Kociumbas, who's here with me, and thank you very much to our technical support team. So we'll try to play the video.
Okay.
Unto ourselves, to see what's there and not already patterned by familiarity, for an unpredicted whole is there, casting a pair of shadows, manipulating its material, advancing, assembling enough kinship that we call it life, our life, what is already many lives, the dimensions of its magnitude veiled to us as we live it. Across the cytoplasm of adjacent cells goes a signal that turns you toward me, turns me into you. We are coupled in quiet tumult, convergent arguments, an alien rhythm becoming familiar, a rhythm of I am here, never to be peeled away. We are become one thing, listening for what's there and not. Through the storm, neem trees on the hill stamp wildly in their roots. We have passed through the spring, but what thing has passed through us? Now your laughter transparentizes me, and whose sense of the self doesn't swerve? Your unconditional foreignness grows conditional, stops being foreign at all. With your nearness, my lens on the world shifts. A peristaltic contraction courses through us as a single wave. No longer can we keep our distance, our lips brush, or the tips of ourselves. But what language are you whispering to me, your teeth stained by Nilgiri tea, above the trills and whistles in the high limbs, above the screech of a bulldozer blade, shoving rubble up the wounded street, above the silence of an eyeless tick climbing a grass stem? I understand nothing but the lust your voice incites, the declamatory tenderness. How and who can say what force has queued up this hour for our small voices to merge into a carnality that did not exist before now? Come to this unforeseen conjunction. We slip into one another. We take hold in a pulse of heat, in a yes and no, For already we can see we are no longer what we were, as I find you within me, not fused, not bonded, but lodged. And for you, is it the same? The intensity of such investment, each of us excited by the volatility of the other, which propels us in a rush as something, perhaps our lips brush or the tips of ourselves, stripping away what was before? Was there even anything before? The reconfiguration is instantaneous experience. It is being itself. But whose being now? Was I endowed with some special pliability so that becoming part of you, I didn't pass through my own nihilation? And what does the death of who you were mean to me, except that now you are present constantly? Because excess is what it took for us to transform, to effulge. You cast your life beyond itself. Can't you sense me with your ecstatic openness, like rain mingling with red earth? Without you I survived, and with you I live again in a radical augmentation of identity, because we have effaced our outer limits, because we summoned each other. In you, I cast my life beyond itself.
Thank you so much. Are you there, Forrest? You're there. Yes, you're there. Yeah, thank you so much for this incredible reading. This last poem seems to me like a really great illustration of what you said at the beginning about lichens and how lichens are these collective organisms that once again through proximity become something else or become something more. And in this last poem, it's, I guess, human intimacy which makes us
Something more
augment.
too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's only in our relationship with others that we really become ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a perfect conclusion. I think it's a perfect and beautiful conclusion to this great reading. So thank you very much, and thank you all of you for watching. And I invite everybody to join this conversation if you feel like asking a question or making a comment.